Okay, ladies and gentlemen, are we ready to start our second and final roundtable of the afternoon? And we'll be following that with some more discussion from the panel and reflections before we finish today. And I'll remind you that our intent here at CTAF is to not only develop a deep understanding of the issues based on available evidence and clinical and policy expertise, but to try to identify issues that we might act on, that we might work on to improve the ability to bring just health care to our patients. So we have an incredible array here of policy and pharmacy experts. I mean, just taking a look at people's qualifications makes the eyes tired. And one thing I'll say for our clinical group, they gave very concise answers because they're used to 10-minute office appointments. Policy people, on the other hand, have not had that same kind of training. So I will ask each one of you to be concise, succinct in your answers, even though I know all of you could give a lecture on any aspect of the healthcare system for the rest of the day. All right, that said, we're joined today by Sean Sullivan, who's the professor and dean up at UW and is a noted health economist. And while he couldn't be here this morning, we've had some prep calls, and I told him what happened this morning. And as our legitimate economist on the table here, the question has come up about the market for pharmaceuticals. And I thought perhaps we could just start with a little quick primer on how the market works to set prices in the pharmaceutical system. Because when I took econ, that's the way it works.
What was how it works?
The market.
Yeah, the market, yeah. Well, so thank you, and thanks for inviting me to be here. So, you know, in the United States, we have a national economic policy that actually supports the life sciences industry in the United States. And we need to balance that, of course, against, you know, a sustainable and an affordable healthcare system. In terms of sort of how the market works, for the life sciences industry, you know, we as a country allow the technology manufacturers patents, which give them a virtual monopoly on products. That patent system is 20 years. Secondly, in this country, one of the very few, by the way, in the world, there is no central negotiation for pricing. Many of you may have read recently the agreement between Gilead and France, where they negotiated not just with France, but a few other Central European or Western European countries. That was a central negotiation for pricing in that country. We don't have that mechanism here in the United States. We also have a lot of regulation that is actually quite favorable for the life sciences industry in terms of payment. There really isn't an opportunity for a private sector health plan like a Kaiser or a Blue Shield or a Blue Cross or the federal government to just categorically say no to a treatment. We are not going to reimburse it. What in fact they do, and what you heard in the earlier panel, is to say, yes, we're going to reimburse it, but we're going to restrict it to A, B, C, D, E, F, lock it in a box, if you will. And the discussions are always around how big is that box, how locked is locked, and what will it take for a patient to get to it. So that's sort of the system. It's a free pricing system here, and unlike most other countries here in the United States, when a manufacturer sets a price, over time, they can actually increase that price. That is very difficult to do in other countries. And in fact, in other countries, there are mandatory price reductions. So that makes the United States a very interesting market for the industry. They really want to be successful. In fact, most make most of their profits in the United States as compared to the rest of the world. And they want to preserve that. They want to preserve those rules and regulations which allow them to function. And I guess I'll finish so I don't take up 50 minutes, which professors do. I'll finish by saying we as a country made a conscious decision over time with policy to actually set up the system I just described because we want a healthy life sciences industry in this country. There are more life sciences companies in this country than there are in the rest of the world. And we want that. We want that for jobs. We want that for a whole host of reasons. So we have to balance these sort of national economic policies with an affordable and a sustainable healthcare system.
Thank you. So with that concise background, how does it actually start playing out in the marketplace where prices are negotiated? And maybe we could ask Steve Miller about that.
Yeah, so in the United States marketplace, it's a fragmented marketplace, and so for us, we represent about 85 million members. They come from both health plans, commercially insured plans, government and public sector employers. And so we accumulate all this volume with the hopes that we can negotiate best price for our membership. And so drugs actually get pooled into essentially three categories. There are drugs that are called clinical inclusions. You have to have these drugs. They're unique in the marketplace. And so the pharmaceutical company knows that, we know that, and in those particular cases, you become a price acceptor. There's very little wiggle room for negotiating. And so if you look at when Sovaldi came out, Sovaldi was unique in its category, and so we became a price acceptor for Sovaldi. There are other drugs that are still on the marketplace but have no place in modern therapy. These would be called clinical excludes. Less than 1% of drugs fit this, but if you think about older antihypertensive agents, Aldomet, it's still in the market, it just has no role in treatment. You would exclude those because they don't benefit the patient. Lots of side effects, and so they're not needed. 85% of drugs are what are called clinical optional. That is, you can arbitrage them. So there's 10 penicillins in the marketplace. You can tell a company, you can be the one penicillin I use if you give me the best price. So for 85% of drugs, we can negotiate very aggressively, and we actually have more membership than France has. And so we can often get even better prices than what you'd see elsewhere. But for those 15% of drugs that are unique in the marketplace, we truly become price acceptors.
Tony, would you like to comment a little bit on how prices are set in the U.S. marketplace for pharmaceuticals?
So there's one really important element to this, and Steve's right, and the broader analysis of how the market is set is right. But one thing that I would reflect on is the market is really structured in a way to make pricing very sticky, particularly launch prices when manufacturers come to market. And the reason for this, and Matt Salo has heard me say this 100,000 times, mostly when I come to lobby him, is to say the way the Medicaid pricing rules are set. Back in 1990, Congress established a law that said that whatever the lowest price in the private market is, that's the price that must be effectuated at most for the Medicaid program. And what that basically means is manufacturers are really only willing to discount to private purchasers down to the level that they're willing to charge Medicaid for. So I can't prove this, but I suspect that the way they look at this is something that the representative from Gilead was talking about before. They figure out what they want to sell it to Medicaid for. They figure that that's going to be the world price for other public programs, and then they launch it at the price above that they need to be able to hold the price they want to sell it to Medicaid for. So it's kind of there's a strange way to back into this. And the way I describe it, Jed, is back before this law took effect, when the 85% of the drugs where there's a clinical choice, where physicians, if they're well organized, can pick drug A instead of drug B, assuming you could do that most of the time, it was very common for organizations like Kaiser or very well organized hospital systems to negotiate discounts on the order of 50, 60, 70% off of the prevailing wholesale price. When that law went into effect, very quickly, all of those contracts were terminated, and the discounting level went right to the minimum rebate level before you start having the effect of the best price provision. So what that means is you now, when a drug first comes to market, the price is very sticky. It's very hard for people, even who are very well organized, to put pressure to pull the price down below a certain level. And it also means that there's an enormous incentive for when follow-on competitors come in, which we're going to see in this drug class very soon, to simply peg the prevailing market price or the wholesale price that's generally available to people right at where the other competitors are, because everybody knows that the competition can only go so far down with private purchasers. So even if starting tomorrow or sometime shortly thereafter, my Permanente colleagues are able to say, there's two very similar drugs on the market, and we should be using drug A or drug B, and maybe we should just take this out to market. It's not like we're going to be able to say, wow, you know, the cost of production of these drugs is very low. You'd think we'd be able to negotiate a very low price on this. The truth is, the negotiations with the drug manufacturers get hung up at that Medicaid rebate level, and that's really as far down as you can drive the prices in the private market.
So maybe we should ask Matt whether he could do even a better job negotiating prices. Now, Matt, you have this federally sort of mandated thing, but then you can go beyond that, can you not?
That's correct. So, yeah, Medicaid's in an interesting position, and I think it's important to note, and Tony's exactly right, Medicaid gets the quote-unquote best price that's in the market. Although the Medicaid statute that provides that also provides something else which is important and which gets us back to, I think, the broader conversation we want to have, which is about markets. And the other provision that's in Medicaid makes Medicaid not a free market. Because the quid pro quo of Medicaid gets the quote-unquote best price is Medicaid has to cover every single drug that is approved by the FDA, with a couple of exceptions. You know, we can't do the, well, we're just going to do 2 drugs in the class and then not cover the rest. Now, having said that, there are still a bunch of exceptions. So the VA and 340B and all sorts of other big public federal entities can go and get much lower prices, higher discounts, whatever, and they do in these drugs and lots of others. So it sounds great. Your actual question, which is, can states get effectively even lower? And yes. So what states tend to do is that they go out and sort of aftermarket kind of go and get what are called supplemental rebates. And in essence, what that is it's saying, similar to what was just said, if there are competitors, we can't not cover 9 of those penicillins, but we could put 1 of them on a preferred list or 2 on a preferred list and prior authorization for the rest. So that enables states to go and get better prices on a lot of drugs. Doesn't work, as Steve pointed out, doesn't work if it's in an acceptor class. So one of the issues that I think we found with Sovaldi is, as the only drug in the market, there was no leverage to be able to say, give us a supplemental rebate. Will that ability change when AbbVie and then Merck come out on the market? I hope so. I really, really hope so. But I don't know. And I think that's the fear. The fear is that we don't know. And the fear is that the price that's been set has been a floor and not a ceiling. And I think that's going to be the ultimate concern. And I think I would just, end back at the beginning with, on the market side, I don't want to I'm not an anti-market guy. I do not want to be viewed as an anti-market guy. I don't care how much profit they make to produce really wonderful drugs. But let's not pretend that this is a free market, especially when we're talking about hepatitis C. I mean, this is not, Sony saying, yeah, I'm going to charge, $80,000 for a 85-inch plasma HD TV. You got it? You want it? Cool. This is more along the lines of, how much are you charging for clean water post Katrina? Every person we heard earlier today talked about the compelling public interest, the fact that this is an infectious disease, this is a nationwide epidemic, we have a public health mandate, and we're certainly hearing from all sorts of people how unconscionable it is not to treat everybody. I agree. I'd love to treat them all, but we can't at these prices, and something has got to give there, because and we'll talk about this more, all of the things that states are doing and that private that payers are doing, folks on the manufacturing side will say, well, you see, spending isn't actually all that high. It's not going to be a problem. What are you complaining about? What are you whining about? You're not actually spending that much money. Well, look at New York. Look at how much New York is spending, and it'll scare you. And I think at the end of the day, we're going to have to figure out something much, much different about how we're approaching this. Because at the end of the day, when individuals, whether they're asymptomatic or whether they're women of childbirth age, or whether they're cirrhosis stage 0, 1, 2, when they take a case before the courts and say, I've got an infectious disease, you have a cure, and you're not giving it to me, but you're going to give it to that guy, those don't hold up. No restriction holds up in that. And then at that point, you are covering everybody.
Thanks, Matt. So as complicated as the market is for pharmaceuticals, once you get into the realm of litigation, who knows what will happen? We will talk about that in a moment. Before we leave this topic, and before I hear from other members on the panel, I recall an article in the New England Journal years ago about Me Too drugs, and people had been bemoaning all these Me Too drugs because they didn't represent clinical innovation and advance. But the article pointed out that the availability of Me Too drugs allowed price competition. But are you saying that that doesn't work here?
I'm saying that the potential benefit of Me Too drugs was never realized because of the law's hamstringing competition.
Okay. So we have a somewhat unusual situation in the United States. There's no central negotiator. There are these rules about discounting for certain public programs that have an impact onto the commercial sector. The people who probably have the most direct experience internationally with how these pricing systems are set up would be Newell, David, and Steve. And I wonder if we could ask for some of your perspective there, and then we'll get down into it. Steve, Newell, you want to start?
So, well, let me first say that I'm not in the contracting group or the pricing group. I'm in the research part of our business.
Right. Nor is anyone here.
Yes. So, but I want to say that because there are very strict rules for us on the research side that we really don't have much interaction with people on the pricing and contracting side. So these guys have much more interactions with our people on contracting pricing than I do. So having said that, I think outside the U.S., it's a very different scenario where the thinking about pricing is actually changing, where we're now actually having payers pay for outcomes and not pills. And that has been slow to come to the U.S. Sean's group has a repository of what are called managed entry schemes that has listing, Sean may want to talk about this in a little bit, of all these different agreements that go on around the world. I would say Italy probably wins the prize for the most. And I think they've been slow to come to the U.S. because they are really hard to do. Merck is engaged in a few of them. My engagement has been that we often have to validate the data. So I have people that get data from these agreements, and we have to validate that the drug did what we thought it would. There was a recent example in the U.S. with Medtronic and Aetna that I'm not sure is in the I'm not sure how much this is really in the public domain yet, but basically they gave their insulin pumps to Aetna for free, and then as patients achieved certain outcomes, then they got paid for that. So there are all sorts of new sort of innovative ways to think about pricing, but we, again, have got much more experience outside the U.S. than we do inside the U.S.
Thanks. David, you had talked about analogies with houses, other things. Sean mentioned that your company has worked something out in France. Your perspective?
So the first thing I would just suggest is a thought experiment, which is if you looked at Sovaldi, Harvoni, and they had exactly the same clinical profile that they do, except that you had to take the drug for 4 years, and it cost $20,000 a year, would we be in this room? In fact, there are lots and lots of drugs that cost $20,000 a year or more if you want to be treated for rheumatoid arthritis, if you want to be treated for MS. We can make a long list of drugs that cost well north of $20,000 a year, and they're not cures. And so the first thing that I think occurred to us is that there's a there's a profound misalignment between the time you pay for Harvoni and the time that you get the benefit. For chronic treatments, and this would be true for our HIV drugs, there's almost perfect alignment between when you pay for them and when you get the benefit. You pay for them for the rest of your life, and it knocks your viral load down to undetectable levels, and you can live a more or less normal life. With Hep C, you pay in 8 weeks or maybe in 12 weeks, and you have a long tail of benefit for the rest of your life, but the payment is not aligned. So we started to think about that and said, well, are there other areas of the economy in which there's, if you will, a high upfront payment and a long tail of benefit? And of course there are. It's how we pay for our houses. It's how we pay for capital equipment in businesses and so forth. But it's a new problem for the drug industry and a new problem for medicine. I mean, I guess there are areas of medicine and capital equipment, certainly hospitals are funded by bonds, in which we've made those decisions. But you know, for a cure, and especially a short duration cure, we haven't gotten there yet. And I guess I would say that Gilead as a company, and perhaps you know, our competitors as they come online, would be very interested in a discussion to try to create better alignment. Because after all, I mean, if you are paying for medicines that cost $25,000 a year that just alleviate symptoms, and the lifetime cost of those could be many hundreds of thousands of dollars, it's a different case to look at a short duration cure whose price is dropping while we're sitting here. Competition, I think, will reduce prices to some degree. There's much more contracting and price negotiation than anybody has really let on so far. You know, the short duration dropping from 12 to 8 and potentially even to 6 or 4 weeks will continue to drive the price down yet further. So the prices are the highest that they'll ever be right now, but they're dropping. But that budget impact problem is something we haven't figured out yet, and there's a lot of value in having that discussion.
So we are absolutely going to come to that budget impact question. I just want to ask you
Sure.
to say a little bit more about the arrangement in France, and then we'll ask for Steve's perspectives on this globally.
So when we negotiate with single-payer systems like France or the UK or Germany or Spain or Italy, it's basically a government single negotiation for the country, not so different than the negotiations we have, say, with the VA here, or to some degree with Medicaid programs, in which there are substantial discounts. I think that Bill Geyer, a little while ago, mentioned that the government price in France is not very different than the government price in the U.S., where we have negotiated with government single payers, a la the Veterans Administration.
And how are outcomes being tracked and adjudicated and then paid?
Oh, no. That's not the French system. The French system is simply a agreed upon price for the drug, and there is not tracking and outcomes. You may be thinking about Italy.
I may be. Thank you. Steve.
Maybe I should start just by a quick counter question. So at least in the public press reports on the French deal, I thought it was very interesting because some of us were starting to create menus of different policy options to handle the problem of a very expensive, very clinically effective drug. And if you look to the French example, what they had said they were going to do for a while was to charge a luxury tax on the profits of the company above a certain, level, something that comes to mind when you think of France. That would be the French Express. And then through a negotiation, I'm sure they shifted gears. But what I read was that there was both a lower price, the lowest in Europe, but also there were new triggers that if the volume of expected cases were greater, that the price would be further lowered, so that in a sense the price and the ultimate aggregate cost was in some way linked to consideration around budget impact for the central state payer. Is that correct?
Correct. It's completely around budget impact, and that strategy of imposing a retroactive tax based on volume thresholds is something that the French government, it occurred to the French government about 3 months ago, and is now being adjudicated in French courts. It will go to the French Supreme Court about whether it is constitutional or not. And so I can't comment beyond that.
Ooh la la.
And let me just add that the French actually have been doing price volume agreements for decades. So that's not new, that they do price volume agreements.
Thanks. So some broader perspective, Steve, and then we'll address other issues.
So as you've noticed, I helped organize this meeting, and I've managed to shoehorn my way onto the policy roundtable. I hope you don't mind. I'll try to keep it brief. It's partly because CTAF and ICER found ourselves very much part of this conversation. And I think Sovaldi, it's fair to say, even though these issues have been percolating for many years, Sovaldi really kind of crystallized a lot of the tensions in the system. What I found just remarkable was the sense of powerlessness that I heard from Medicaid systems and the VA system and even private payers, the sense that they were an acceptor of prices, that they couldn't really negotiate. And we've heard a lot about rebates and AWPs and everything. And what I think partly is really remarkable from an international perspective is we seem not to talk about prices linked to the incremental clinical contribution of a drug. So, nor do we really talk, in conversations with Medicaid, VA, and other payers, they were very focused on the short-term budget implications. To them, value was really driven by their ability to absorb the short-term costs for a drug that they admitted was quite clinically superior. Manufacturers, I think, are more used to now in the global context thinking about incremental cost effectiveness. I mean, they do get used to talking to many payers globally about we're this much better and our price is scaled so that that is a reasonable incremental cost for the average benefit that patients get. That still sometimes leaves the budget impact problem. That doesn't always solve that problem. And whether it's a vaccine that also has lifelong benefits, or whether it's the upcoming genetic therapies that might be one shot for a lifetime of cure, we seem bereft of policy mechanisms, certainly in this country, to deal with that. And again, when you started to create a menu, it started with public shaming of manufacturers around the price, and then you kind of hit a vacuum because people would talk about, well, it should be like a mortgage system where you amortize costs over many years. These are ideas and concepts that just have virtually no track record, even of informal policy conversations in the United States, at least to my knowledge. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to step back and see pricing as part of the issue, but even in international settings where they have prices linked to marginal clinical value, affordability is still proving very challenging and is going to raise lots of questions.
So, Dan.
This is just another riff on what you were just saying, but what is the impact of moral suasion where Henry Waxman or Chuck Grassley writes a letter to a company? Does that have any impact at all on your tendency to cut deals?
It certainly gets our attention.
I would have thought so.
And we have different views about the moral gravity of those actors.
Well, they're not here to defend themselves, but go on.
But it's worth, maybe I can ask a question too. I think many people would agree that there was almost an unwritten rule that seemed to be operating between manufacturers and payers that if a treatment was going to be targeted at a relatively small patient population, the prices could be high, again, relative to their clinical benefit and other considerations. And again, it seemed like that unwritten rule fell apart around Sovaldi, and that we're still in a conversation in the policy community around what that means. Would you agree?
No.
Okay.
No, and the reason I wouldn't, because I was thinking a lot about this when we were talking in the first panel about trade-offs. And, it seemed to me that some of the trade-offs proposed were false in the sense that how many well baby exams would you forego for giving somebody who's 60 years old Sovaldi? What about trade-offs between weeding out extremely ineffective care in favor of more effective care? I think
that's false.
What was that?
Sorry?
I said I think that's a false construct.
Okay, so we'll register that. Go ahead,
So-
David. Finish your comment.
No, so there is a great deal of ineffective care throughout the system. I don't think anyone, on any side of the table would argue that. I do think that our analytics and our ability to make policy choices based on Steve's comparative effectiveness research are limited and have been limited. And it's quite difficult if you look at it from the perspective of clinical medicine. If you're running a hospital or running a physician's group, to limit ineffective and to some degree any even harmful care that's produced in the clinical setting. It's very difficult to do.
You know, I asked Sean when we were prepping for our meeting about examples in the U.S. or elsewhere of what's called disinvestment, you know, things perhaps with a much higher ICER or even harm, weeding them out of the system. And Sean, how many examples were you able to give me?
Not many, actually. In the U.S., I think you all talked about the Choosing Wisely initiative, which is an initiative to identify low-value care. But the active disinvestment of those programs, pharmaceuticals, et cetera, is very low. I think the Medicaid director said that. So I can think of very little examples in the United States. By the way, in the UK, they don't call it disinvestment, they call it bottom scrubbing. You can take that for whatever way you'd like. But they actually have active programs to disinvest from technologies that have low value for money, because they operate under a much more constrained budget where they need to then redeploy those resources to fund technologies, programs, services that are higher value for money.
So, Steve Miller, you must have programs that try to eliminate waste, low-value use of pharmaceuticals. Have those generated the kinds of dollars that can be redeployed in a way that we're talking?
You know, that's been the role of generics over the years. So moving patients from branded products to generic products save money, and that money can be used to pay for these brand new, more expensive products. But the reality is we've gotten to 85% generic fill rates, and so every new patient started on a branded product, that drops to the bottom line. So over the last 10 years, we've been able to keep total pharmacy spend in the United States at about $250 billion. But in the near future, because of things like Sovaldi, because of PCSK9 inhibitors, PD-1 inhibitors, the new treatments for NASH, and I can go on, you're going to see pharmacy costs go from $250 to $300 to $400 to $500 billion on an annual basis, and that's not sustainable. And the idea that, the drug works too fast, and so that was their mistake, is ridiculous. The fact that they're recommending that we take mortgages out and buy it like a house is ridiculous also. There's nothing wrong with just dropping the price of the drug. That seems like the straightest, simplest way to get to affordability.
Well, I've always been nervous about having my liver repossessed, so I resonate a little bit with the analogy. So, Matt, you said that's a false choice, and I did hear you. Let's explain.
So I hear this a lot from the other end of the table whenever we talk about this issue, and it's sort of like the Wizard of Oz moment where he's like, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Go look over there. Go to the witch's castle and get her broom back. You can't just say, well, there are bigger problems in the world than drug prices. There's unnecessary hospitalizations and inefficiency. Go fix those before you come and look behind the curtain. You know what? We are trying to fix those. We are actively engaged every single day trying to fix those. Every single state Medicaid agency is out there trying to break down the barriers to better, more effective, more cost-efficient care. Dual eligibles, people with co-occurring substance abuse and mental health disorders. We do that all day long. We also have to look at drug prices for issues for this issue. It's not mutually exclusive. We have to do both, and it's false because it is a real trade-off. We don't have this magical 20 or 30-year budget window that we can, and Steve's exactly right, trying to think about mortgaging, that's crazy. We have a 1-year budget window or a 2-year budget window. And if costs spike up in one area, you have to make trade-offs.
But if you were able to spread out those costs over a long period of time, would that moderate your budget impact?
We have other things to pay for in the future.
I just want to ask Matt.
So, yeah, I mean, yeah. Let's look at what this this country's track record at doing things like that. What's the savings rate in this country? 0%. What is the track record of state government? I'm a state government guy. I've been doing it my whole life. What's the track record of state government in things like pensions? Terrible. This is not a sustainable solution to mortgage our future to pay for something we can't afford right now.
So it's not only one manufacturer that has come out with high-priced drugs, so I do want to diffuse things a little bit. Newell, your company must have some high-priced drugs. What is your thinking about how that impacts society?
Well, I do think it's, with the hepatitis C drugs, it is a bit unique for a couple of reasons. One is that the payment is all up front and the benefits occur later. So it's a difference between paying for a cure and paying for a treatment. And we have to think about that very differently. And the other is just the sheer size of the population. So for our high-priced drugs, I think someone said this before, but they're for pretty small populations. So we haven't gotten the, at least, intense public scrutiny that my colleague has gotten here in the hepatitis C space. Having said that, we do have some hepatitis C drugs that are in the pipeline and will probably be out in the next year or two. So we may be undergoing the same sort of scrutiny, but we haven't as of yet. But I would like to get back to this discussion with Matt about the sort of disinvestment and optimization, because it just seems striking to me this morning that we went through the morning and we said we have a drug that is, or a series of drugs that are below the standard thresholds for cost effectiveness. Pretty well-established criteria, and we can't afford them. And no one mentioned, until Neil mentioned about choosing wisely, that we pay for a lot of things that are way above the threshold. And so somehow we just have to, I think, better reconcile those two things about how inefficient our healthcare system is and how we could think about optimizing our healthcare system. And I know that I agree with you, Matt, it is unbelievably difficult. And for those of you who have children, you know that it's easier to give a 2-year-old something than to take something away. So this is really not easy stuff, but I think to make headroom for innovative drugs and innovative services and other treatments, we have to figure out how to stop paying and doing things that offer little or no value.
We
Thanks,
have to
Newell.
also do that.
I want to ask Tony a question here. Tony, I remember when you explained to me when I was coming into the policy world the notion of insurance risk, and it was fine if Kaiser Permanente had a family of people who had an enzyme deficiency disease, and it cost a huge amount of money over the course of a lifetime for that person, that family. That's an insurance risk. When does the insurance risk start coming over into the all overall affordability budget impact category? At what price does that happen? At what percent does that happen? Because we were questioned before about where's that threshold. How do you think about that?
I think it's a great question, and there's not really an answer to it, but I think it tees up the discussion that you want to have about this, because that's what's going on here. The analysis that we looked at this morning had to do with established treatments, cost effectiveness relative to those established treatments. But there's two things that are really going on here. One, the data from this morning demonstrated that at no point in time does this new therapy actually pay for itself in terms of what it's replacing. So yes, it's a cure, yes, it's a better outcome, it's all of that good stuff. But if this was another form of tech, you would expect to see a reduction in overall cost for what's going on here. So that's not happening, and that kind of thing doesn't get captured in a cost effectiveness analysis, which is really about two different things. What's going on here is you've got a history of a medical condition where you were treating maybe 5 or 10% of the infected population, and you had a set of self-limiting therapies because they were so onerous that were realistically only going to be provided to the 5 or so percent, 10% of the population, and it was very expensive stuff to come up with and produce and all of that stuff, and so it set a benchmark for a cost for the treatment at that level, and society was able to absorb it relatively comfortably because it was a relatively small population, because we were trying to support all the innovation and all of this good stuff. The problem here is that you're shifting from a very narrow population that you're treating to where you want to go, which is to a broad population to treat. And there's no, there's no intellectual construct for that shift where you're basically having to think about things on a global budgeted kind of basis, and things that are big enough, they're going to have meaningful fiscal impact either on a state program or a private program or whatever it is. But I had this conversation with some of David's colleagues. I said, look, in my view, when I look at this, you've got a situation where you're moving from you had 5 or 10% of the people going to be treated to ideally a place where you're eventually going to be able to treat everybody if we can build the capacity to do that. And God knows, I'd love to spend a couple million of these dollars and build the capacity to get out there and get people treated. But if you do that, the drug's price has one too many zeros on it, because you're multiplying the utilization of the drug by a factor of 10 or 20, but you're using a pricing model that existed for treating 1/10 or 1/20 of those people. So that's why I think when we have this conversation, you can have a cost effectiveness analysis, and for an individual patient that totally makes sense. It doesn't answer the insurance question. It doesn't answer the global cost question. And so what I think we should be thinking about is, how do we figure out how to make this accessible to everybody who can potentially benefit from it? That's going to require massive investment in capacity building, and it's going to require a more rational pricing approach to this that is realistic about who's actually going to get treated. And I think that's what the problem is here, Jay.
So let's stay on this threshold or transition between the traditional insurance risk and whatever we want to call what we're doing now. So Steve, you put this notion of the 0.5 to 1% PMPM change into our discussions this morning. Do you want to talk about where that kind of threshold comes from, and related to what Tony says, when things are different between the old models and this population?
Yes. So when we evaluate on an annual way the drug trends, in the last several years, drug trends have been about 4% year over year. So that's the total cost for drugs are going up by about 4%. For 2015 or 2014, that trend's going to be double digits. That increase of about 7%, half of it's due to actually the treatment of hepatitis C. The other half is due to non-sterile compounds. And so it's a huge jump. And what happens is plan sponsors get really concerned when any one product on the commercial side is about 1% increase. On the public side, it's usually about 0.5%. So that's where we start scrutinizing it to say, is there another alternative there? It doesn't mean we don't pay for it. So we've actually been the largest payer for Sovaldi in 2014. And we encourage our patients, we want them to get the best treatments possible. But the biggest problem is this is an orphan drug price for a non-orphan drug. And so there's historically been a social contract where the pharmaceutical companies would look at the total budget impact and price it accordingly. When the price was announced last December, when the drug came out to the marketplace, no one knew what it was going to be. Pharmasite, who invented the drug, was planning to sell it at $36,000 a treatment course. And so when Gilead purchased the product, they didn't add any scientific value to it. So this isn't scientific innovation. This is just financial innovation. They took the product, added $50,000 to the cost, and put it into the marketplace. And so for us, this is what has gotten plan sponsors really spun up. And so that's why this 1%, and this isn't 1%, this is somewhere between 3 and 4% for commercial plans.
So I want to give Steve a chance to comment on this threshold transition issue, and then perhaps, if David wishes, a chance to respond to that.
Well, one of the things that we realized after our first meeting in March on Sovaldi was that when the CTAF panel voted that Sovaldi represented a low value, that it probably conflated multiple issues, but clearly these issues of cost effectiveness and budget impact. And so that's one of the most, the main reasons that we wanted to pull those apart in the new voting structure that you saw today, because as Tony said, They are kind of theoretically linked, but they can be completely disconjugate at the same time. And that's what we're seeing with these drugs, where over a lifetime they appear to meet traditional, if you will, cost-effectiveness thresholds. And I'll take Newell's comment to mean that pharmaceutical companies in America are happy with using cost-effectiveness thresholds to judge the value of their innovations. But so in pulling those two apart, we realized, well, we have a kind of track record for thresholds on cost-effectiveness. What about budget impact? The real issue there is there's a possibility that by trying to pay for something in the short term, you will have to displace resources from somewhere else that could have provided greater value, even in the short term. And or it could lead to an immediate spike in healthcare premiums for everybody that would, in a sense, ultimately reduce access to care across the board. So there's no economic theory out there. We started to ask real-world purchasers in the United States. And one of the key features here is that it differs payer by payer. Right. Some of them have a lot of flexibility and would say, well, at 1%, we'd be okay in general. We might have to wrestle with it, but others would say at 0.5%, that's still way too high. We just don't have the flexibility in our year-to-year budgets to be able to take that from a single. And somebody made the comment earlier, maybe it was you, Jed, 0.5%, 1%, that's not a big deal. But when overall healthcare premiums are growing maybe 3 to 4%, if 0.5 or 1% is coming from one single new drug, you can imagine that you multiply that by other new drugs or whatever, and that really is probably not going to work. So we decided to come out with a threshold, 0.5 to 1%, as a trigger. And this is part of the tension with our report. People think that we're assuming that all people are going to be coming in and getting treated, so it's a false kind of hypothetical model. The point is to say that we need a policy trigger to get these folks to the table ahead of time to sort this out, because we want to bring into the healthcare system new treatments of high care value in a way that will align with high health system value. And that's what unfortunately did not seem to happen with Sovaldi. And I don't mean to pick on it, because I'm sure there are many others that, drugs that have had very marginal benefits at very high prices. But I think that it's a way to trigger a policy conversation. And yes, it can be used to generate a fictional price, the price at which it would meet both cost effectiveness and budget impact kind of threshold. So we hope to contribute to that conversation. But as you know, I'm a big fan of collaborative action, and that's what this is supposed to trigger. Collaborative action to try to address a good problem. We have a great new drug. We just need to figure out how to afford it.
Thanks. So, David, you have an opportunity to reply, and then Sean, I want to ask you, there are no economic theories that help us understand this?
My friend Richard Thaler, who's an economist at the University of Chicago, he and I were talking about this a few months ago, and I mentioned to him that Gilead is working on a cure for HIV. We've been working on it for a long time. We have the leading treatments in the EU and in the US for HIV. And he said, so how in the world would you price that? How in the world, if you had one pill that cured HIV, would you even begin to think about the pricing? And it's an interesting question. I want to correct a misrepresentation that Steve made a minute ago of our acquisition of Pharmaset. And this has been out there for a while. People have basically said, well, Gilead just bought a drug and then marked it up by $50,000. In fact, we had a program for hepatitis B and hepatitis C that goes back about 15 years. And when we bought Pharmaset for $11 billion, our scientific advisory board basically took a very hard look at the molecule sivosbuvir, which they had developed, and understood that it fit perfectly into our development program. At the time, that was a phase 2 compound with very little clinical data behind it. They had, in order to raise money from venture investors, had guesstimated what they might charge in the market, which was in the middle 30s, and then actually revised that in subsequent SEC filings upward later. But it was a team with no commercial experience and a team with not a drug, but with a molecule that took us in our program another 3 years to turn into a drug. So it wasn't as simple as Steve suggested.
Thanks, David. Sean, so economic theory, your graduate students sitting around wouldn't be able to tell us what applies here?
Well, they wouldn't be able to offer a theory to support Steve's 0.5 to 1% threshold. I mean, to me, it sounds reasonable. It seems reasonable, but you know, affordability is very different for different payers, and Steve mentioned that, and I completely agree with him. What's affordable to Medi-Cal, or our state Medicaid system in Washington, or the prison system, is going to be very different than what's affordable to Kaiser or Blue Cross or Blue Shield or Aetna or Express Scripts or whoever. And so having a standard threshold, a percentage, doesn't make sense to me. Having one that's linked to the specific budget constraints that are faced by the different payers then would make sense to me.
So let's talk about affordability a little bit. What does affordability really mean if it's something more than budget impact? So perhaps Matt, then Tony?
Well, it is budget impact. And I think I want to go back to this question about, you know, we keep talking about this construct of, well, it's the value of the cure. You know, well, you know, if you can price it at this because, well, it's cheaper than a liver transplant. But that doesn't hold up, and I'll explain why. I mean, and I'll think about it in a very micro way. And to pick on somebody else, you know, there was a drug called Makina, which, you know, there used to be this compounded product that was put together to help reduce the risk of preterm birth. And it was $15 a week. And then this new drug comes out, does the same thing, but it's a pill. It's better. $1,500 a week. Still less than the cost of a preterm birth. That's not the way we can't sustain that kind of thinking. You know, we can't sustain the kind of, well, you know, what I hear is, well, Alzheimer's costs this country trillions of dollars. Okay, well, is the cure going to be trillions of dollars minus $1 and that's value? You know, we can't just say, here's a totally cool amount of healthcare spending, and as long as we move the needle as who benefits, you know, hospitals lose, pharma wins, and whatever. We can't just say that's cool as long as we're rearranging the deck chairs. Because, you know, I think we think about affordability, I think about budgets, I think about real-term consequences. You know, state governments right now, we're actually in a little bit of a luxury in that, you know, state revenues haven't been as in the toilet as much as they have been over the past couple of years. But if you look at the trends of state spending over the past couple of years since the Great Recession, healthcare spending, Medicaid spending has continued to go up. Everything else has been held back. And the piper for those is going to have to get paid. Washington State has a court order to spend like $1 billion on K through 12 education next year.
$2 billion.
$2 billion. Sorry. I reduced your problem. There's not going to be another $2 billion in taxes. That's going to come from somewhere. We got to reduce the spend. And if not, there's going to be real-world consequences, and they'll be unfortunate.
Thank you. So, Tony, a little bit about affordability, and then I want to ask about the example you brought up, because there was pushback on McKenna, and I want to just have an explanation of that. Go ahead, Tony.
So, you know, affordability is a huge issue throughout the healthcare system in general right now. I mean, we're 17-18% of gross domestic product, being the cost of the healthcare system. Over the past 20 years, it's run at 2 and 3 times the general rate of inflation. And I think, as Matt's alluding to, that public policymakers, the folks who have to come up with the money to pay for this in public programs, have said enough's enough. That's all we hear from our customers at Kaiser Permanente, who are very happy with the clinical care that's being delivered and the innovations that we've come forward with, but there's no more money to continue to allow the kind of growth that's gone on for the last 20 years. And I think there's a disconnect in some respects in the conversation that is going behind the pricing of these products. And it's particularly acute in the pharmaceutical sector, but it's also in other supply sectors in healthcare, where society, both through employers buying coverage, people being taxed, policymakers having to figure out how to finance things, are like, we're not going to go to 20. We're not going to keep going to 25. We're not going to go on the same trend that we've been on over the last 2 or 3 decades. It's time for the healthcare system to start taking the enormous largesse that the rest of society provides to us and figure out how to solve what we need to solve to, including innovation inside of that envelope. And so when you have a product that's coming to market that's saying, this is better, and we, drug industry, think you health plans need to go figure out how to extract more money out of the rest of society, I think we in the health plan community are having to say, that's not the deal anymore. It's just not. There's plenty of money, and if you're going to come with something that's new and innovative, you need to replace something else. And here's a perfect example where it's not replacing something else. It's adding to the cost, it's adding benefit, but it's needlessly, it's the pricing makes no sense. This is why we get so agitated about it, is the pricing really doesn't make sense in terms of what this therapy appears to be designed ultimately to do. And the suggestion that's been said here, and we've heard it repeatedly, that you health plans just need to be more creative about how you're going to finance this and do it over the long term, is fundamentally misguided. The fact is, there's plenty of money to be able to be generated in this, to be able to provide the product the way it should be, and for us to pay for it, and to still lavishly fund the innovation that needs to go on here. I mean, very frankly, I have very little interest in coming up with a novel financing approach that will, permanently insert into the overall cost of healthcare the cost of this one therapy, to mortgage it over the next 30 years so that one company can basically realize, instead of its traditional 40% operating margin, a 70% operating margin. If I really thought it was going to be impairing innovation moving forward, then maybe we should spend time figuring out how to be super creative on the financing side like this. But there's this and a number of other facts around this particular example that make it clear that it is just out of whack what's going on here. And that's why I'm glad that we're having this conversation, because it is fundamentally about the price.
So, Steve Miller, the industry, Express Scripts, other people who consume pharmaceuticals were able to push back on the company that was marketing Makena. How did that work?
It actually turned out that the FDA went against their own guidance to allow that to happen. So it turns out that when you have a compounded product and someone then manufactures it, you're not allowed to prescribe the compounded product. The FDA actually overrode its own rules and allowed the compounded product to stay in the marketplace to compete. And so that's actually how we were able to get to a lower price. The reality is, like I said, when we become a price acceptor, so you use the example of France. I have more patients than France has, yet I cannot negotiate the same price that France could negotiate. And the reason is I couldn't threaten anyone with a luxury tax. And so if I had that power to threaten, I would have been able to perhaps get a lower price. But they don't offer that same price. And so in this particular case, what we're going to have to hope is that when these are temporary monopolies, and that hopefully tomorrow we'll have approval of another product, and hopefully they'll be as concerned as all of us are in this room about access, and make access more affordable for more people.
Thank you. We have about 25 minutes left, and I want to start challenging the panel to come up with paths forward other than what we're currently doing, which I've heard referred to as muddling through. But before we take up that challenge, any reactions or comments from our CTAF panel that you'd like to express?
I do, Jed. So I've been listening to this, and I'm hearing a lot of justifications basically for charging whatever you want. Other treatments we pay for are not as effective, so therefore we can charge whatever we want. It's a lifetime cure, so therefore we can charge whatever we want. It works really fast instead of amortizing over, many months, therefore we can charge whatever we want. You could amortize the cost of this, therefore we can charge whatever we want. How about just lowering the price, because then we wouldn't have all these discussions. I will give you some examples of things that work very well that don't require mortgages for the future. Last week I treated somebody with TPA. It's a pretty new innovative treatment. She had an enormous stroke, and at the end of a 1-hour treatment, she was back to normal. We're not going to amortize that. That was a few $1,000s for a very effective treatment. Sepsis for treatment with antibiotics, few $1,000s for treatment. It's a lifetime cure in somebody that would die. So I don't think that's a valid argument to say, well, it's really effective, therefore we should be paying for it. I think that the price is just too high, and I would have to agree with Tony that you can get a reasonable amount out of it without having to go so high. The other comment is, you said the price will come down, and you'd also referred to multiple sclerosis drugs. I have a lot of interest in multiple sclerosis drugs. When multiple sclerosis drugs first came out, they were $12,000 a year. And we thought, oh my gosh, this is horrible. How can we possibly afford to spend $12,000 a year? Well, now they've been out long enough that they're starting to go generic, and the price of all of them is up to $36,000 to $50,000 a year. Prices do not go down, and the new ones that are coming out are coming in at $65,000 a year. So I would believe it when I see it, but I've been prescribing medicines for a long time. They don't come down. And I think the answer here is exactly what we've been talking about, which is rather than trying to come up with something innovative and unique, some kind of discussion maybe at the time things are priced about what would it be a reasonable return on investment versus, I think price controls are a bad idea in general because it does stifle innovation. But at some point we have to realize that there's got to be some kind of limit to it. And I think that's just my observation having listened.
Thanks, Jeff. Others? Paul.
Yeah, I think we've got I think this is the problem where as a treatment becomes more effective and as it starts to cure, the less we're willing to pay for it in terms of a price, particularly if it's all going to happen right away. And I'm wondering if it's setting up some incentive to, is there really an incentive to cure HIV with one pill, financially? And it can't be solved by the companies. It can't be solved by the current budget. I think I'd be curious what people think, but we need some national policy to say for the government to come and listen. If someone can cure HIV with one pill, we're going to have this money set aside for you, and we will pay this amount, rather than have that be somehow forced into any given budget in any one year. So I agree. I think it's a problem of expectations, but without society as a whole willing to pay for it.
Sean.
I just want to comment on that and support Paul's suggestion. I have a colleague just down the hall from me. In his lab, they're investigating regenerative technology that they hope will cure diabetes with a single injection. A single injection. What do you think that's going to cost? And more importantly, how are we as a country going to finance that? And we're going to have to think about very innovative ways of financing technology that cures very prevalent diseases like diabetes, et cetera, because we're going to get there. And we should have a national conversation about this as opposed to one-off conversations. This is the beginning of a national conversation about how to finance cures. It's not the end. And so I just support Paul's comment.
Steve, and then Tony.
So I was going to...
No, I would just say that I completely agree with that. And I think, whoever said that this is just the first of many is likely to be true. It's funny, polling shows that a majority of Americans believe that the pharmaceutical industry has cures in the back room for a number of dread diseases, including cancers, that they're not willing to release because they're built on chronicity. And the truth is that the industry is built on chronicity. but so are the payers in terms of annual budgets, annual rate, annual Medicaid, program allocations from governments, and it's true in Europe too. You would think that a France or a Germany having a single payer system in effect could capture all of the downstream medical and social benefits from a cure. But in the era of austerity, they're in one-year budget cycles too. And so everyone is kind of facing the same budget impact problem.
So I was going to perhaps get us started down the road towards a path towards the future by identifying what I think is an important need. It seems like as drugs are coming through the FDA process, they can still arrive on delivery with a price and kind of shock the payer world. There's not, I know there are lots of reasons, but is there a possible policy mechanism that would allow more preventive policy making between manufacturers, payers, and the broader society as we see these potential large budget impact drugs coming through the system? Because whatever we decide to do, whether it's going to be limiting the patients who can get it, bringing the price down, stretching out the payments, or whatever else, reinsurance, it seems like to kick that off, we need a better early warning system as things are coming through, and some way to trigger early discussion. I'm wondering if people think that there's anything that they think that might work in that regard.
So Tony and then Steve?
Well, the one thing I would note from the earlier conversation is this regenerative therapy that's being developed by your colleague. It's being developed. So it is being financed in some way, shape, or form. This research is going on. The real question is whether or not the continued assurance that that type of research will go on is the current model the most effective and efficient way to ensure that that does happen.
No, I'm sorry. What I was suggesting is that we have to have a conversation not about how to finance his research, how to finance that cure once he or any number of other labs who are working in the same area develop that regenerative technology.
No.
It's how to finance
the bringing it to market
and the price that it's going to command, because he's not going to commercialize it. We will spin it off to some company or sell it to some company, and they will commercialize it.
And there's so there's the issue, right? I mean, that's the way we do this now, and that's what happened in this particular case. The company that bought Sofosbuvir spent twice what everybody else thought it was going to go for, and the pricing is now what the pricing is to pay for that investment, and it's probably twice what it otherwise would have been. I mean, there's some dispute over that. I do think the idea of awards, that award funds, we do need to come up with more creative ways to incentivize cures. That's an important discussion that we need to have. I think a piece of that conversation, Jed, is examining our current financing and innovation model and ask ourselves, are we getting what we're paying for, or are we getting what we're paying for, but we don't really know that's what we're paying for? So but the other piece of this that I was struck by was the rationalization that this is a cure and we're paying for other things that aren't a cure. We're paying a lot more for other things that aren't a cure. I mean, I've had this observation for many years on many of the cancer drugs. I can't believe we're paying for things like we're paying for things when they're not a cure. It's like we're paying for cures, but we're not getting the cures. And now we're flipping that upside down, saying, oh, but something that really is a cure, we should pay even more than that. So I just think people need to step back, look at the way this thing is being priced as a whole, the way the market pricing is working in general, because there's fundamentally something is broken, and we're not getting the types of things that we really want to get. In this particular cure that got developed, it got developed, by a very small company that had intensive government investment in it over time. The research costs were pretty modest. They brought it to market. I mean, God bless them. They brought it to market. It's great. It should be rewarded. The question is whether the rewards are appropriate, or does the amount that we're rewarding causing a vicious circle that's causing this kind of pricing?
So I want to keep track as we go along, because we're trying to identify options and ideas. So we had the idea of a precautionary warning system to start the conversation around prices and budget impact. You said something about awards for innovation. You might want to say another word about that. Is there a place where that happens? What does that mean?
I've seen proposals for it along the lines of what Paul was recommending. Senator Sanders had a proposal for this floating around a little while ago. You can smirk or not about that. But the idea was to create an actual, to pay for the innovation up front and then make it available to society so it can be spread widely, quickly, rather than being a financial model that is very hard for the healthcare system to absorb.
Well, we're not smirking at Bernie Sanders, our next president, so please. Okay.
So, you know, for the last year, I've been the chief whining officer for my company, and as you can see, it's been totally ineffectual. And so over the last year, we've thought a lot about what would we do actually policy-wise to change this, because it's so we have actually suggestions for pharma, for government, and for payers. And really briefly, for pharma, number one is to show good judgment. So obey that social contract. We actually are willing to have discussions with you before you bring the products to the marketplace. Since we've made that offer, we've had more and more companies doing that, which is doing exactly what Steve said. They don't have to listen to us, but at least they're getting our idea of what the impact's going to be to people's budgets. Second is that biosimilars will make the same headroom for these new expensive drugs as generics did in the last several decades. And the pharmaceutical industry has, for the most part, been fighting the introduction of biosimilars. They need to actually become advocates because they will protect them in the marketplace. Third is that they play this game with patents where they evergreen or they pay for delay. They have the power to stop that now, and the money saved actually helps pay for these new products. And then the fourth thing that pharma can do today is that international pricing. You know, the U.S. has been paying for the world's defense. We're now being asked to pay for world pharmaceutical innovations. We're 4.6% of the world's population. We spend 33% of the pharmaceutical dollars. We represent over 70% of pharmaceutical profits. And so making parity across international countries, just Western countries, we're not talking about third world countries, would be very popular with payers. What does the government have to do? The vast majority of basic science research is coming from the NIH. We need to adequately fund the NIH. And the NIH has this beautiful mechanism where they can target unmet needs. And so they can actually put grants where if we need new antibiotics, if we need treatments for Ebola or other things. Second is we need to modernize the FDA. And the FDA, the faster we get drugs through the pipeline, which is good for pharma, it actually brings down prices because you have multiple products competing in a category. The third thing government needs to do is tort reform. So if you want to have cures, for instance, for Alzheimer's, you need to provide some protection from untoward side effects. It doesn't mean you don't set up funds to protect patients, but you actually have to help shield the pharmaceutical companies. And finally, and we testified for this in the 21st Century Cures Act that is being considered now, is these things for rewards and other innovative ways to help fund innovation. Then finally, for payers, they shouldn't be off the hook either. Payers have to continue to pay, which means if you don't like Sovaldi at $84,000, what would you pay? It's not going to get down to $10,000. And so we do this thought experiment with all of our payers. What would you pay? Because you can't just have it for free. The second thing is that the payers actually have to start advocating, because the Congress will not make these changes unless people advocate, and it's the payers that actually have the populations that control the people.
Thank you. That's a great list. Now, Matt, you guys, one second, Bob, I want to make sure we hear from the panel here. You guys wrote a letter, or the NAMD wrote a letter with a number of policy options. Anything in there that we should put out on the table here, or new ideas from the discussion?
Yeah, so I think the letter, you can take a look at it at our website, MedicaidDirectors.org, lays out in about 8 pages a number of thoughts on these issues. And it's kind of broken down into two. There's the larger issue about where are we going with drug prices, and that's a big, and we need to have national conversations, and this kind of forum is really, really important. And we need to get the taxpayer engaged in conversations about this. We focused a little bit on sort of the Sovaldi Hep C issue because it's different, and I think the solutions there are different because, and this has been brought up a couple of times already today, is that this is an infectious disease. This is a communicable disease. This is I think, and should be, a national priority. What did this country do when we realized that we could eradicate smallpox or polio? Did we sort of throw our hands up and say, well, let's let a whole bunch of different payers just sort it out and we hope it works out? No, we had concerted, focused national strategies in terms of how to get there and how to finance that. If that's what this is, if that's what Hep C is, and I would argue it is, then I think we need a clearly articulated, much more aggressive federal presence involved. And I think that's going to, we laid out a bunch of things. It can be, some issues that were laid out here, risk corridors or other types of reinsurance. State governments can't afford those big spikes. Could we, if the actual trajectory of spend is, as a lot of people have said, over a 15 or 20-year period and it's kind of a plateau, okay, we could probably afford that. I don't think that's going to happen, but we could probably afford that. So let's build in some type of, here's what we expect. If costs go up beyond that, well, then there's some sort of federal reinsurance. There's a lot of things we can do. With HIV/AIDS, we created a Ryan White Act. Do we have something like that here? There's a lot of things we can put on the table. The vast majority of the things that we talked about had nothing to do with price controls, had nothing to do with profit margins, but we have a lot of things on the table we want to talk about.
So, Bob, we're trying to get a lot of ideas out on the table. The panel will have a chance for comment and reflection in a moment. Did you want to put another potential policy idea out there?
I'd just like to make clear that when we're talking about the policy here, we need to really highlight there's something that's going on in this discussion. After Jeff kicked us off, I've listened to everything that everybody said up here, and I could go on for a day on each one of those myself. We all know what we're talking about here in all the little ways, and it's covering such a broad area that one of the issues we're really dealing with here, obviously, is drug company pricing. The research model and what we come up with, where we're going to go with it in the future, what happens when the next one that actually, because this is not it. This is not going to break the system. It's really a big scare, but it's not going to actually trash the system. The next one may. Every time I talk about this with anybody, including the guy that actually was on the team that first sequenced the Hep C, he's scared of Alzheimer's. When I start talking about this, he's terrified of that because the only way that our society pays for that is take our national defense budget and go right straight for it. And this is the point that we need to keep in mind here. We're talking about, in this particular case, something that when Jeff Tice uses the word cure, we better pay attention. That's the way we need to actually think about this. We tackled polio with a vaccine. We don't need a vaccine for this. We got something that can actually treat people with the disease and eliminate the virus, and we don't ever have to worry about it again. Now, in a perfect world, that's great. We know we're not going to get it, particularly with IV drug users, which, bad little group of people to talk about because they won't behave while we treat them. But we need to actually separate the policy, to me, between the actual systemic issues that we do have with development and pricing and the difference that it makes when you're really talking about cure, because this is a different animal.
Thanks, Bob. And of course, I do look forward to an HCV vaccine because that's prevention, which is going to be even better. We want to elicit comments from everybody on our expert panel here. I think we've heard from Matt and Steve Newell. Something to put on the table here?
Well, there are pricing models that are used outside the U.S., but I'm not sure that they apply to this situation because of the reasons that you just mentioned. So, for example, the U.K. has value-based pricing. It's based on ICERs. It's based on incremental cost-effectiveness ratios. And in this case, they would have said, this is an acceptable price. So I think, the struggle is dealing with the affordability issue and the fact that this is a cure. I don't think we have good answers for that.
Thank you. David, anything else to contribute?
I just want to make a comment on the Alzheimer's point. We did an exercise inside the company earlier this year in which we looked very hard at Alzheimer's. Since 1995, all of the research projects in big pharma companies and small biotechs that had been pursued and what their level of funding and R&D was. And there have been about 1,100 projects or companies chasing down Alzheimer's. So far, we have 0 to show for it. And in round numbers, the investment has been about $100 billion. And so our thought was, well, what happens if Biogen IDAC finds a successful molecule and a successful patient, management treatment, let alone a cure for Alzheimer's, how would they begin to think about the pricing for that, given the prevalence and the fear around the disease?
It would be wonderful to bring that data that you've discovered or found in your company and work with Steve to write a paper highlighting that very point. That would be wonderful.
We did the same thing for hepatitis C. Anyone want to guess what the industry-wide investment in Hep C was since 1995? $50 billion, and 710 companies, and a 99% failure rate. So, when you think about it, I also thought, the idea of a prize was rattling around in my brain for a second, and there's some really interesting historical examples, but my favorite one is that the problem of longitude was solved by a prize in the 18th century. It was a prize that Parliament put up because British shipping was being devastated by failures of navigation. And that prize, and I think was the equivalent of $3 or $4 million today. The impact on British shipping was many logs from that.
That's a great historical example. Sean, do you want to think of some other things that we should consider in this thought exercise?
Yes, I have one that may be slightly oblique to the conversation, but I think would be interesting. But I want to comment on the prize. There have been a lot of conversations about a prize, and in a case where there is large public health need, and this is clearly an area with public health implications, the government could step in and essentially buy the patent from the company, make the product available, give it to everyone at very low cost, and be done with the infection. This has been talked about, but we don't have a mechanism to negotiate with a company that has a cure centrally to actually engage in that conversation. Anyway, so I do have a suggestion. And before I do, it just meant you've introduced me as an economist, and I am from this nice little institution about 10 miles to the north here. But I'm also the chair of the Premier Blue Cross P&T committee and have been for 15 years. And so engaging in these conversations is something that I've done and we've done for quite a long time. And from my point of view, this drug and its predecessor, this is a game changer for hepatitis C in many respects. And it creates a cure, assuming that there's not a large reinfection rate. And the payers are going to pay for this product. They're going to do it. They're doing it already. As Steve said, it's they're the biggest financiers of Gilead's profits right now. They're going to pay for this medication. The value of this treatment is not in the pill. It's not in the first dose. It's not in the 10th dose. The value of this medication is in the 84th dose, the last one. And what we might think about now, given that we're going to be paying for this treatment, is how do we get patients who we've committed to offering the medication to take all 84 of those pills, to complete the regimen. That's where the value of this drug will show up. Because if you have half the people you initiate not finish, that is a waste of resources, by the way. So there's a method to do this. How did we handle tuberculosis many years ago? Directly observed therapy. Why not find publicly accessible health professionals? And as the dean of a pharmacy school, I would argue that pharmacists are very accessible for this. And have directly observed therapy. Have patients come in for 84 days and have their therapy administered. When I was a practicing pharmacist, I did this with antabuse. For patients who were alcohol abusers, I gave a small little Dixie cup full of water and an antabuse tablet to many patients who'd come in daily. Why not think about innovative strategies, given that we are going to pay for this medication, to getting the true value out of this product, which is making sure that people actually finish it?
Thank you. One niggling thing's in my head before we ask Steve for some closing comments. And Matt, I want to ask you as a representative, you said you've been in state government all your life. I hear that states are the laboratory for democracy. Mm-hmm. Could they be the laboratory for innovation in pricing and payment and delivery, or is it so federally regulated, no good?
You will.
Ooh. Oh, I thought he was trying to answer that question. We try. We try. In an area like Hep C, we've been unable. And I think that the challenge has been, you think about it's pricing. When you have pricing that's laid out essentially in the statute, it's hard to deviate from it. Pharma complains that I complain too much about pharmaceutical pricing, but I also complain a lot about how we pay federally qualified health centers because their payments are dictated in the statute and we can't touch it. States tried to go and get supplemental rebates on Sovaldi and didn't get very far because to truly negotiate here, you don't need volume, you need an ability to move the market. So if California, with 11 million covered lives, goes in to a company and says, give us additional rebates, but they don't have any ability to move the market, they're going to be a lot less effective than, say, Rhode Island, with a much tinier number of people, if they could move the market and just say, we're going to cover you or not. And we really haven't had the ability ultimately, and I think that Gilead knows this, to move the market. Sure, we can and have said we're going to put in place protocols. But I think, again, nobody thinks those are going to be sustainable. So there's no real moving of the market there ultimately. So there's no real need to negotiate.
Thank you. Last comment, Steve?
Yeah. To Sean's point, we actually have developed a model to try to drive adherence because we believe, like he said, this is really important. So everyone who we treat, we actually admit them to a service. We actually have pharmacists trained in hepatitis. We have nurse coordinators. We have social workers to help them make their copay. We actually even have a predictive model where we can predict which patients will be adherent and which ones won't. And so we're able to surround them with more resources. And so depending on if the patient is likely to not be adherent, they actually get everything up to daily calls from a specialist. And so it's scalable. So direct observed therapy is not scalable, but we've developed a scalable model where we can do this actually over the tens of thousands of patients we're treating, because he's exactly right. If we don't get the patient to the 84th day, then we probably shouldn't have started the patient.
Short comment, Tony.
Yeah, I just want to amplify on Matt's. You asked the state, what can the state do? There are, in this particular instance, there are some opportunities that the states could pursue. It's an infectious disease, as the point has been made. It's a public health problem. There is a case to be made, particularly at the radical economics that have been presented from a population basis, that the states should simply organize its own treatment program, and take it off the hands of, and it's particularly justifiable in this case where a majority of the treatment is in Medicaid and in the correctional facilities, that the state could take a point of view that says, look, we're just going to try to make access available to everybody in our state, and particularly with multiple products coming forward, a state could establish such a program and then go to the manufacturers and put it out to bid, just global access. Everybody in the state, we want to make sure they can get it once we have the capacity within the medical system to provide it to everybody. So there are different models that could be used, but they would be radically different from how our system is currently constructed and paid for.
Thanks, Tony. So, Steve, I think it's only appropriate that you get the last word, since we've been building towards this moment since our first review of sofosbuvir and oncoming therapies, differentiating the distinction between care value and health system value, trying to figure out affordability and what on earth we can do about it. Steve.
Well, first, again, I will not have the last word, I hope, because I want the panel obviously is going to come back and circle on these things. I do want to, early on, thank the panel, because clearly we've sorted all the problems today, and we now know what we're going to do going forward with this drug and other similar situations. Now, sadly, we haven't, obviously. But it is so important to have these kinds of conversations. Again, we haven't even plumbed the full spectrum of things that could happen here. I often start with not even France, but in India, they basically mandate that an important drug that is not being provided at a price they feel reasonable is suddenly in the public domain, and others can come and make generics. Once in the United States history, the federal government threatened to take over the intellectual property of a drug maker that was charging too high a price. It was during the anthrax scare, not that long ago. And the drug company lowered its price. Those are way out there on the end of the spectrum. And Matt's letter, which I hope those of you who are interested in this area will take a look at, really lays out a lot of very well-considered options around both pricing, but a lot on the payment side, including, as he said, reinsurance, et cetera. And then Steve Miller, you said, I think one of the first things you said was pharmaceuticals, and I would say everybody, needs to operate with good faith. I must say I'm not that optimistic. That good faith by itself, obviously not by itself, you didn't intend that, but I want to try to figure out how we can create policy mechanisms that make good faith the right business thing to do as well. So how we do that exactly is not clear, but we do need, I think, ultimately to help the major players in the pricing and payment conversation, manufacturers and both public and private payers, think a little bit outside the box. So to me, payers need to realize that budget impact is not the only relevant measure of value, that the incremental clinical benefits for patients and the price, it's still value, but you need to think about that, not just budget impact. And my grand hope is that manufacturers will also start to feel that affordability is part of their responsibility too, that it's not just creating great treatments at incrementally reasonable prices, but that they share a responsibility for bringing those into a healthcare system in a sustainable way. What policy mechanisms can trigger that, we're still going to work on, but I think keeping these two types of value clear and realizing that we want both is going to help us.
Steve, thank you. And thank you to each and every one of our panel members. We had a pointed yet civil social discourse about this very difficult topic. So please help me thank our panel. Well, we can excuse our other... Well, okay. So now we have the opportunity for more consideration by the CTAF panel and the folks from the Policy Roundtable number 2 of best practices and policy recommendations. So we want to take one step beyond even what we've just been talking about from the perspectives of the institutions you represent, the stakeholders, and your own thoughts. Have at it. Come on, panel.
Well, I'm a little overwhelmed, but I think that three things that came to mind as I listened to all of this. One is that no one really talked about transparency and costs, and I think that might be another opportunity that should be brought to the table, and that's the costs in development. And then two other things that just kept resonating as I listened to this second panel in particular is I sort of feel like we're being held hostage. And I do a lot of quality work, and so we talk about normalization of deviance. And so I almost want to go back and re-vote my health system value because I base that based on everything that we had talked about before, but now that I've listened to this, it's clear that, as everyone's already said, this is already in the marketplace and we're already going to be prescribing it. And even though there'll be policies set in place for the third and the fourth, I think that we actually said that everybody should be entitled to it. And so those who scream loudest and have the right doctors willing to advocate for them will get this. So this will already be in the system. And it's just the first drug that's going to be in the system. And so we may already be going down the rabbit hole. And so the health value discussion might need to be revisited, knowing how automatic some of this might be.
You just said you felt like you were being held hostage, and that keeps sticking in my head. What do you mean by that? Does that resonate?
I'm a doctor. I got a patient. She's got a problem. I got a cure. It would be unethical for me not to ensure that she gets that.
Thank you.
So I can wear my public policy hat all I want, but as a clinician, right is right.
Marge, you have a comment?
I think what this all boils down to is, can we get Big Pharma to change the way it currently is working? So there are only so many options for that change. We can try to legislate it and implement some form of price controls, which nobody sounds very enthusiastic about. We can sweet talk them and put a lot of pressure in terms of sort of prompting their conscience about the social good and what this means. So they clearly have a lot of defenses already in place to counter that. So I'm not sure sweet talking is going to do a lot of good, and we don't have a lot of influence to go on strike for all Gilead products. That seems a little limited in terms of the capacity to do that. Or is there a way to game the system? So I go back to their comment about they have a way of helping to support the pharmaceutical costs for those who can't pay. So does that mean payers then arbitrarily say, so that California says, we can pay half the cost of this drug, we can't pay the entire cost. So we will pay half the cost, and you, the patient, to indicate your motivation, have got to go ahead and submit a letter to Gilead and claiming financial need, because clearly everybody who's in DHCS is a financial need, and we're now turning to you to help pay the rest of the cost. They get to still keep it at $84,000. Neil gets all of his patients covered at a price they can afford. So I'm sure there's something wrong with that system, but that's the only one I can come up with. Or we just let it ride until the next big one comes along, and finally the tsunami comes, and the feds step in and say, we can't price drugs this way in this country.
Thanks, Marge. You put another idea on the table. That's great. Comments from the panel? Ideas? Meg?
I also want to thank the panel, because I think this is a fascinating discussion. And I actually have a question. Is this being taped in a way that the public will be able to see if anyone wants to sit through 9 hours, whatever it has been today? Great. Thank you, because I have lots of people I'd like to watch this, so thank you. Some things that I thought struck me that I hadn't really considered before are, I think, the really interesting comments by the Vice President of Gilead around how this has come to the fore because of the upfront cost, and that there are so many other expenses that actually are spread out that go under the radar. So whether it's the MS patient or it's the cancer patient or the HIV patient, that there are many, many other similar areas where it just depends over how much time we're accruing those costs that either make them come to the fore as headlines or not. And I think that's fascinating. I am not saying that that means we should accept high pricing, but I think it reminds us that this is a much larger issue. Another thing is, I thought a very interesting and somewhat frank comment that seemed maybe appropriately manipulative about framing this as a contagious disease that therefore merits attention and maybe even kind of a takeover by the state because of claiming there's an urgency there, when I think that the issue around contagion is something, when Christine and I were talking about this earlier, we're not sure exactly how infectious this really is beyond the population that currently has it. So it's an interesting and I think kind of shrewd strategy that perhaps, having said that, now no longer is shrewd, to try to figure out how to take that comment that it's contagious and therefore we all care about it as a way to then generate policy, which might mean government takeover. Because I don't know that the science is actually there around it being contagious, or I'm going to give it to Doug by sitting next to him, and therefore he cares about treating me. And along that line, it also just brings up the issues around charismatic illnesses. And a comment made here I thought was very informative, but we didn't have time to get into it. It's a tangent, is around ASCO, which is the American Society of Clinical Oncologists, which is trying to take on the issues around affordability for cancer treatment drugs, which are phenomenally expensive and sometimes, as we know, extend life by a minute or 3, maybe 2 months, and yet the costs are huge. And they are taking on the issue around affordability in what I would argue is an extremely charismatic and urgent and emotionally charged area. And I think we might try to learn from what it is they're doing to try to further that conversation. So maybe that's my suggestion to Steve's point about what I might suggest. I think we need to see what's going on there because it might help inform us.
I want to add just a word of thanks to Megs, to the panel. Well, both panels, actually. I've learned a lot today. It's unsatisfying, I suppose, in a way, to come to the end of a day like today and having worked as hard as we have, and to see seemingly be so inconclusive. But for myself, I want to say that I do believe we're participating in a very important social experiment to try to elevate the discourse in our country about the cost-worthiness of care. Nothing that we're going to do is going to repeal the human capacity to invent new things, which will outstrip the human capacity to pay for them. That's just basic reality. So Dr. Miller said it well, and others have said it today. Next week, next month, there will be another example and another example. And we all know about the unsustainable costs in healthcare that we're going to have to address better than we have so far. It's probably telltale that I'm an Oregonian originally, so I thought the notion of having condition treatment pairs rated according to their worthiness wasn't a bad idea, because until you're pretty sure that the least valuable thing you are paying for is more valuable than the most valuable thing you're not paying for, you don't really have a rational system, and nobody in this room believes that we currently exist in that. We've heard plenty of evidence for that today. It's disturbing that we don't really dance around the question of price. We danced all over the top of it, actually, today, but we don't really come up with a solution. I think we just have to be honest about that. We've heard ideas, but basically what we're admitting to each other is we don't think any of them will work. But at the same time, we're saying, and we can't keep going the way we are. So the social experiment that I'm pleased to participate in is step by step, conversation one after another like this, we will get to better solutions. We may have heard some of them today. I'm not sure. Read Davis Sobel's book, Longitude, and think about prizes, and it did work to get us clocks, and we have a lot of fine examples of that today. Is that an approach? Well, I wrote down a lot of them, but I do, and I'll end with this, I think. I do want to be part of that conversation that tries to find a system that's more efficient, heard something about that today, more effective, and more fair. And I wonder if we think that where we are today with relative to the treatment of Hep C, the pricing of it, and the way that's going to affect our ability to provide it to the people in need, whether we believe that that's a fair system. Personally, I don't think so.
I share your pleasure in participating in this forum. I think we've heard some great discussions today, and I want to thank everybody that participated. I think this is a great example of the disruption that's caused by a new technology. It's very much like Uber and taxi cab or Airbnb and the hotel service. The impact of these new antiviral agents has been hugely disruptive, in a good way, you could argue. But it's been also a source of great anguish for us to see the problems that have come along with this. I would just argue that it's early days, and I guess I don't have any policy recommendations, but I think it's very clear from this discussion that despite the lack of evidence that we usually demand, these are wonder drugs. And I think that came out, even though the studies are imperfect, these are marvelous drugs. I think in time we will learn whom to treat. We'll learn about the longer-term consequences of treatment, both good and bad, and the impact of continuing innovation. I think right now, all the momentum and all the stakeholders in the Hep C community is to go forward. If I were a patient and harbored the virus, I would insist on being treated. I think those of us who take care of patients would want to treat our patients, try to find a way. I think that if you look at it from a patient advocacy perspective, you see this as a communicable disease, and it should be eradicated. I think it's fair to say that if you're a company with this kind of a drug, you're going to advertise directly to patients, you're going to try to get as big a market share as you can, and you're going to charge whatever the market will bear for as long as you can. But I have an example from my own experience. I'm reminded when coronary artery bypass came along in the late 1960s. This was a hugely expensive treatment. It was applicable to hundreds of thousands of patients. It was the leading cause of death in this country. Basically there was no other treatment. There was no other treatment that augmented myocardial blood flow. Medical treatment was all symptomatic. And it was, I wouldn't say the Wild West, but it was a heyday. Some of the comments or some of the terminology was we were treating widowmaker lesions. That was an LAD lesion, was a widowmaker lesion. The data that we had is very much like the data that we saw today. Short-term studies, and the outcome was operative mortality. Operative mortality was considered value. And we were comparing the operative mortality, which was very low, compared with the operative mortality in other types of cardiac surgery, which is much higher. So it was a bonanza. I mean, a lot of people got treated, and Americans are, fix it. Let's get it done, rather than passively accepting disability and premature death. But my hopeful comment today is that in time, as better evidence became available, we learned which patients had a meaningful benefit from surgery. Reimbursement declined as third-party payers, RBRVS replaced usual, customary, and regular, and reasonable, and the DRG system began to moderate hospital costs. The statins came along and stabilized plaques and slowed the atherosclerotic process. Medical therapy improved, and coronary stenting supplanted a lot of coronary bypass surgery in many instances. So now, despite this highly disruptive technology that came along, coronary bypass surgery is used very selectively now. So I think similarly with all the stakeholders in hepatitis C, I think as long as we let scientific evidence be our guide, I think the present disruption will give way to better outcomes for our patients. So I guess it's the George H.W. Bush, stay tuned.
The good Bush. Christine, you had a residual question, I think, about who really needed treatment, as Dan just put it, and whether indeed it would be okay to prioritize patients in clinical ways.
Yeah, and this has definitely been an interesting discussion that I think where I've been wondering is, have we at some point during the day just kind of tacitly accepted the idea that all patients who present for treatment should be treated? Taking that model a little further is that you have a cohort of people who, for some reason or another, have come to attention. So ones who've come to attention because of a problem, I don't think anyone would argue should have treatment because they are suffering from the disease. But we have a screening program that is spottily implemented. We have access to care issues across different strata of our population, which has not yet been fixed. So is it that anybody who wants to be treated can be treated? Is that really who should be treated? Or should we have something that says there are people for whom there is no proven benefit to treatment because there's no proven problem from the disease yet? Are we able to identify those people? Will that give us capacity to then put in a systematic program where we find all the Hep C patients, we find the ones who are actually having problems attributable to the disease, treat them, find the ones who are about to have problems from the disease and treat them, and defer people who don't have problems yet without harming anyone? That's something I wonder about. That's a big deal. But we've talked a lot about big deal changes economically. Maybe we need to have a medical system big deal change. And I don't think we have research that's adequate yet. And one of the things that in the years I've attended CTAF from the audience, that it always seemed to drive what types of things do we want to see evidence about. And so in that vein, I'll say we don't see evidence about the, quote, asymptomatic population. Are they truly asymptomatic? We've heard some very compelling stories. And for those individuals, yes, they have had symptoms. But I don't know if that applies to the vast majority of patients who have fibrosis 0, 1, and 2. We also don't know a lot of data about how to find out who is which stage of fibrosis, and we definitely need more research into validating that. So I think that there's a lot of medical system work that can be done here too, as well as some of the economic plans that were brought forth.
Thanks, Christine. So we have a recommendation for some clinical additional thought as well as delivery system action in addition to the policy stuff. Any other comments from our panel members before we go and do our usual post-meeting reflection? Bob.
It appears to me that the law, the California law that set the mandate that Medi-Cal can't pay more for the drug than the lowest amount paid to the private sector, could that be revisited? Could the state legislature be lobbied to take a look at the unintended consequence that's flown from that law that was intended to prevent gouging of Medi-Cal?
It's a federal law, not a state.
Oh, it's a federal.
Enough said.
So what I would hope is that the pricing gets revisited. I don't have great hope that it will happen. I think what we're listening to is that there's fundamentally, we don't actually have a market for drug prices. What we have is sort of the opposite of a market, and that's, I think, those of us that believe in sort of capitalism works. There's a problem because there's three buyers here. One buyer is the doctor because the doctor writes the prescription. One buyer is the patient because they're asking for the prescription. One buyer is the actual provider for they're paying for the prescription. And all those folks are not exposed to supply, demand, competition, or cost exposure. And so fundamentally, we've got a real problem because the insurer is the one that cares the most about the cost, but as soon as they say we're not going to pay for it, then the doctor gets upset. They all hate insurance companies anyway because they keep cutting our reimbursement. The patient is, in the middle. They just want to get treated. And so it's really not a functional system. And I don't know that there's any solution that's going to come until we think about just the way this happens, because there really is a problem. I don't want an insurance company telling me what to do, but the insurance company is really the only one that's got any interest in reducing the price. We have a little bit of interest that we work for the integrated system because I want this global thing, but it really is just an issue that we don't, we have a free market without a free market.
Well, I want to be a little bit more optimistic because actually I think we did something quite remarkable today, which is we voted that this technology had good clinical care value. And then we said it had low, at least a majority of us thought that it had low system size or affordability. And that, to me, is a huge, huge step towards justifying, if you need to, risk stratifying patients and saying we only have so many dollars, we have to spend it where we best can. So to me, I actually think this is a positive. I share everyone's frustration and general anger and lack of clear ideas about how we're going to fix all this. But anyway, I'm maybe it's just because I'm more of a cup half full person, but I actually think this has been very, very useful. And again, I also wanted to add my thanks to all the people that contributed to this.
Thanks.
I just wanted to say, since we keep coming back to the economics here, the power, particularly when you talk about when we're going to try to go to the legislature and get change of things, power is always with the patients. They're the voters. That's where the politicians actually react to, much more than even any policy, any trade group, anything else that we come up with. The one person that's always left out of this is totally clueless about what the numbers actually really are, the patients. And all we were talking about here, all we have to go on with most of our voting question things is the wholesale price, because nobody's actually telling us. The people that sit in the room here on our panel that actually do know what they're writing a payment for won't let that number out. And of course, one of the reasons is because we're going to need to know a few more to have valid comparisons about how much this is really painful for us. And if we're going to truly be transparent and really try and get this stuff out on the table and really handle it and have everybody participate in this, we're going to have to include that in it too.
Right, and that goes to the transparency issue that we heard initially from Kim. I'll just reveal that during the course of the day, various people have come up to me and said, that's not really what people are paying, and then they quote this enormous discount, and then I, go to somebody else and they say, oh, that's not right, that's ridiculous. So the fact that we really don't know what is being paid hinders the conversation. I agree with you, Bob. Other comments, suggestions, actions, next steps?
I just wanted to make one comment to Bob's about, that patients don't care because, in fact, most of the burden is being taken off them. Well, patients do care when they are having to pay the premium. And it's that link between the individual as consumer and the individual as patient is what has been so missing from all discussions. And that if people had a greater opportunity to say, what should this system look like that meets Jerry's definition of fair, we might have a better idea of what they're willing to tolerate, both as purchaser, consumer, and as patient.
Okay, then we'll go right into the final section of our agenda, which is reflections and takeaways from the process, from the interactions, going all the way back. Remember, Dr. Tice started the day, going all the way back to there. Let's have some reflections, and then we'll summarize and wrap. Maybe, Jeff, we could start at that end and come all the way around and finish up with Dan.
I think this is really very, the overall thing I think is really valuable. I would like to really give you credit for splitting out the value to the patient from the cost effectiveness for the patient as opposed to the system, because I think that really kind of highlights exactly where the problem lies. This is an effective treatment, makes sense at an individual level. The problem is, I don't care how much you want it. If you can't afford it, you can't afford it. And it leads to some kind of decisions nobody wants to make. So I really like that. I think the new framework makes a lot of sense, and I think it kind of highlights where the problem is and allows us to really kind of focus on thinking about where the actual cost problem. It's not a cost problem at an individual treatment level. It's a societal cost, and I think that really highlighted it. So I think that worked out nicely.
I share Gerald Winslow's appreciation of the conversation today. I share his frustration over the lack of a quick fix. But I'm really appreciative that the conversation has occurred. Finally, we're getting it out, talking about what the basic underlying issues are. And I think it needs to go, beyond the state level eventually to the federal, because I didn't realize that was a federal law. And
so I feel like I'm beating one drum today, and that's clinical effectiveness, but I'll continue with it because that's what my MPH is in. My mother raised me to never complete a course of antibiotics. When I felt better, I stopped.
Yes, thank you.
I worry that the 95+ percentile SVR rates that we see in the trials will not be represented in real-world populations, and that we're already seeing that with rates in the high 80s. And I think that's probably still higher than what we'll actually see once we get beyond those people who are the squeaky wheels who come to their docs and demand to be treated. And that as we move further into patients who are asymptomatic, who screen positive, or to patients who are using intravenous drugs, that we may see even lower rates, low 80s, maybe even 70s. And so some implications of that, I worry that our cost per quality may be overly optimistic. And that also, Sean Sullivan's point toward the end really resonated with me, that we need to develop systems in order to make sure that people like me who aren't used to taking all their medications make it all the way through to the end. Thanks.
I don't know exactly where to start and where to stop. One of the deals here is I think we do have to come to grips with the fact that the word cure is being tossed around with some credibility behind it. And I actually share Alex's feelings about the numbers, because the numbers are never going to be 100% in the real world, even when we get a real cure for whatever. But the reality is we're really perilously close here, if not, and it's a wonderful model to go for when the next problem comes around. The pricing model that we're dealing with here was pioneered in rare diseases, particularly in cancer. I've watched it for the entire history of it. And if you want to know how it really works, come talk to me about Gleevec and a handful of others. The same people, I actually know a number of the people at ASCO who are griping about this now. We tried to explain to them what was going to go on when Herceptin and the next one actually came out, and they said, okay, well, fine when we get there. Gleevec has quadrupled in price is one of their problems right now. I mean, they're in pain there because it has an effect that actually has really touched their lives now. And it didn't for a long damn time. And one of the things that we can do with them is actually partner with them. The more of us that whine louder, the more that people are going to actually pay attention, including the drug companies. And on that one, I'll actually throw out, I really truly appreciate Gilead and everybody, AbbVie, everybody else showing up today. I think we really can't hype that enough. I think we really can't beg and plead enough for all of you to show up every time. At least we got, to my way of thinking, pretty much everybody to the table this time. And that does not happen as often as patients would like to think it does, no matter what you hear. The deal with this is, one of the things you better pay attention to is Gilead's not telling you it's not really a cure. Don't throw that around too much. And they're truly believers in their own numbers. I get that. But these are not bad people. I think I've had some conversations with some from the patient side here. I kind of like that guy, and he's from Gilead. It's a real thing, and we need to pay attention to it because we can have friendly conversations. And we ought to butt heads with one another really hard like you witnessed on this last panel up here. But we ought to keep talking after we're done with it.
I can't trump that. So I won't try. I'll just reemphasize that I also appreciate who came to the table and for all the roundtable. And I also want to thank the CTAF people that provided all the information, and Jeff for the clinical evidence reviews so that we could start to wrap our arms around this. And I think it's wonderful. It's going to help us as we move forward as a model for other conditions that we'll be discussing. And I'm honored to be allowed to be part of this panel. And I thank everyone here for participating.
I couldn't agree more. I'll just say ditto. And by the way, that cost-effectiveness model was really elegant, and congratulations to everybody for doing that. I thought it was just really A+, so thank you.
Thanks. Let's start at this end and come all the way down here.
I guess I would echo that. I actually just want to appreciate how organized you were in getting us the material ahead of time, and then the conversation before, so that by the time we see it here, it's really truly a review, and we've all sort of cogitated and had some real thoughts about it. So I appreciate that. And I just think that the one thing that our conclusion makes me wonder if we've sort of set ourselves up for an implicit two-tier response, so that those who can afford it will get it, and those who can't will have to get really sick to get it.
I think we've always had a two-tier system, and I don't think that will ever that will never go away. And I think I've said everything I have to say, except thank you all, and especially thank you to you, Jed.
Yes, no, I thought the care value analyses were outstanding. I think the health system value is a lot. It's hard to know what to make of that. In some ways, it applies to me that if we're going to say the budget is affordable or unaffordable, I mean, obviously that's true for next year, but it's the other question is, what should that budget be? Should it be higher and lower than it is? And I think that I think of, as a thought experiment, what will be, say, the next thing if we were to have an HIV cure comparable or a breast cancer cure. I would expect that we'd be at the point of, in California, the initiative process would be underway, and there would be a mandate that something would be paid for by the government. So Marge, I'll talk with her later, but I would imagine the patients may want to take over, and the population may want to take over at some point.
I think this has been the best session that we've had in the new model yet. I think that the voting was far smoother than other votings have been. A lot of pre-work, and also setting up the constructs of how are we defining the value and the value to whom, I think has been very helpful. Also, I think it's amazing that we've got such a big room full of people who've stuck with us all day. Yeah. So thanks to everybody, and also I think echoing the CTAF staff, who've I know put a lot of work in all kinds of activities, and I think they really deserve great appreciation.
It's hard to come near the end. I'm going to see how Dan does this.
I'm listening.
Yeah. Well, I have participated in this process for a number of years, and I want to celebrate the fact that we are learning how to address the question of value. It used to bother me a lot that we would talk about assessing new technologies in healthcare and speak as if a half centimeter better on the clinical effectiveness meant that our job was done. I think we did really good work in those assessments, but I always had this nagging feeling that it was, in a sense, a disservice to society because we were not addressing the question of cost and the cost worthiness and the real fact that we will be making trade-offs. Watching and participating in the process today, it seems to me maybe instead of 2 steps, there might be 3, and I'm messing up the thing already. But I mean, there is the question of clinical effectiveness and the quality of the information available to us through the studies. And I hope we never give up on insisting on the highest level of evidence that we can possibly get. And then there's the question of cost worthiness to the patient. What was, to me, I can separate that out. When you start talking about QALYs and also the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, or so-called ICERs, as I probably have tipped my hand today and elsewhere, any conventional wisdom about 0.5% or 1%, any conventional wisdom about 50,000 or 150,000 really deserves some careful scrutiny. How did we arrive at those numbers? And anytime something's conventional and traditional, I think that should heighten our sense of critical scrutiny. So I intend to contribute to that if I can. And then there's a third step, which is system sustainability, which is, to me, a separable issue. A few years ago, we looked at a drug, Ceridase, for Gaucher's disease. the price for that drug dwarfs what we're talking about now, and it isn't a cure. And but the difference is, as I remember the numbers back then, it affected about 1,000 people a year, not millions. So when you get to that final step, you can't ignore the fact that volume, just the sheer volume of it, really becomes almost decisive. And I don't know that we found the metrics there yet. I'm a little bit with Paul. We're still sort of sorting out how much is too much, and how do we know what. So I think we're making huge progress in being able to discuss value in a rational way, and we still have a ways to go.
Last word. Repeating a little bit, but new technology is always disruptive, and I think when you get a new drug like this, it has a profound impact. I spent my entire professional life knowing that there was no treatment for viruses. You could prevent them with a vaccine, but you couldn't treat them. If you had a bacterial illness, you could give an antibiotic. I mean, this is revolutionary. And the sticker shock from this new drug has brought us all together. I mean, it's hugely disruptive. And I guess having lived through the history of coronary bypass, which was equally disruptive, I'm sanguine about the future. We have a market-based health system, for better or for worse. It's the conflict between profit-making and the public good. But I have great faith in Americans. I think we'll figure it out.
That's great. So a couple of announcements. One is that we will continue to accept public written comments on our website until Christmas Eve, because we wouldn't want to interfere with family time. And that website is ctaf@icer-review.org.
Email.
Thank you. We'll accept it by email to Karen. That's good. We will start working on the final report, which will incorporate everything we've heard today, a number of the suggestions for improvements and enhancements to the report, as well as our responses to each and every one of the public comments, and a summary of our afternoon, which will be interesting to write, starting tomorrow morning at 10. So and Karen, when do we expect to have our final report out?
Late January.
Late January. Look for it. We'll be working hard till then. And finally, in conclusion, it is just such a pleasure to work with our panel and the brilliant people who presented the evidence and economic analyses today. We have made a little bit of progress in a very difficult area, and I anticipate that our conversations today will fuel much broader conversations in the press, society, over the next couple of weeks. So with that, I wish you well, thank you, and we are adjourned.
I get the last word.
All right, held it.
As chair, I want to remind you that our next meeting is on April 2nd, also in Oakland, and the subject is integrating behavioral health and primary care. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.